It's a curious thing, but almost every spiritual tradition has this prayer exercise, this meditation. Buddhists do this rather strange, some might say macabre kind of meditation. In the Christian tradition, it's often called the prayer of examen at the end of one's life, but the idea is simply to, as strange as it sounds, imagine yourself laying in your deathbed. Not a popular thing to want to imagine ourselves, but as one's laying there, to ask oneself, what were the things that brought meaning and joy to my life? To kind of look back on one's life and ask oneself, what are those things that gave me life? And we might think of certain accomplishments, obviously of being married, family, and those kinds of things, or certain job accomplishments, getting the raise. You might think we'd think about those material things, buying the new house, but more often than not, if one engaged in that practice, it's interesting what arises in us. First time we fell in love. The birth of our children. Moments when we held vigil over a loved one passing away. That those become the moments that really make up our lives. And it's an interesting spiritual practice to really remind us what's important in the world, because we get caught up in so many unimportant things. Now, tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of the passing of my mother. So today, on this All Saints Sunday, she is most definitely a part of my cloud of witnesses. And I must share with all of you who are living in the midst of sorrow of having lost someone, the reality is that much of the grief and sorrow has lessened, has become less sharp, less painful. But I still find myself, 2 years later, struggling to remember certain things, and it's not the big things that I remember so much or have grief about. It isn't just the weddings and the graduations and the birthday parties. That isn't what I miss so much. What I've discovered, what I miss is the small things. The ability to pick up the phone and call her. Talk to her about my successes, my failures. I bought a new car, Mom. I miss that. I miss being able to tease her. We used to tease each other all the time. I miss that small thing of just simply being able to be together and tease. I miss her hugs. I miss her voice. I miss the small things. And that's, for all of us, a part of the grief. And I think if we looked at what we miss in those who've gone before us, it is those small things. And if I have regrets about my mother, it is that I was so caught up in the busyness and business of life, of raising a family, of work, of going to another committee meeting or whatever, that I missed opportunities to really relish those moments. But if I have any regrets, it is that I was not generous enough of my time, of my spirit, to really celebrate what was truly a gift which gives life meaning. And truth be told, I think if I have regrets, it is always when I am not generous enough to those around me. Now, just about every parable Jesus shares with those around him, it is always, almost invariably, about the generosity of God. So much so that it just doesn't make sense. In our tradition, we call it God's grace, and Jesus over and over and over again is talking about how God's grace is unearned, unmerited, is just given to us. And what's even more a struggle is it's given to those we don't think deserve it, right? And Jesus was over and over talking to the people around him and saying God's love and God's mercy is so big that those people you think are excluded, you've just missed the point. It's scandalous. It's absurd how God's love is. In fact, it doesn't make sense that God will reach out and love the sinner, that God will reach out and love the outcast and the people who don't deserve it. How God's grace is so big that it shatters our expectations. And Jesus, in every story he told, whether it was of a father who welcomed a wayward son who didn't come to say the right words, he just welcomed him and threw him a party, even though he had taken everything from him. And now God's kingdom is found not because you deserved it, but somehow, surprisingly, in a moment you don't expect. Part of what Jesus did over and over again was shatter the expectations of those around him about God's grace. And the truth be told, if we really pay attention, it probably shatters our expectations as well. I'm reminded of a saying. It goes something like, you know, you've made God in your own image when God hates or dislikes the same people you do. You know, you've made God in your own image when God is simply a reflection of your expectations. And I don't think we like hearing that as much as those who heard it long ago. So our parable this morning has the same kind of absurdist illogic about it that most of us would say, you know what? This isn't fair. Right? The story goes, there's a landowner who goes early in the morning, I think about 6 in the morning, dawn. He finds some workers, he invites them, they come to an agreement, I'm going to pay you a denarius, and you go work in my fields. And they're probably happy to find the work, right? But then he goes back, and it's 9 o'clock, 3 hours later, and there are some people looking for work. He hires them. Then they go at noon, he goes and hires them, and then he goes at 3 o'clock, and he goes and hires them. Why aren't you working? Well, no one invited us. He goes and invites them. And then at 5 o'clock, he finds more people needing work, and he invites them to come. I mean, that's odd behavior, let's be truthful. Maybe a lot to work on, and needed as many people as possible. But the landowner does something even stranger. Because what he does is that he has the people who were hired at 5 o'clock, he puts them at the front of the line, and he pays them a denarius. Right? And the same on down the line, 3 o'clock, noon, 9 o'clock, and finally those who've been working all day long, who'd borne the heat of the day, who'd done the most work, they get paid the same thing. And that's not how the world's supposed to work, folks, right? You get what you paid for. I work for a day's wages. I put in a day's work and get a day's wages. But somehow Jesus says that's not how God works in the world. That God's grace and mercy is extended not only to those who work early in the morning, but to those who only work for an hour. It's scandalous. It's unfair. I'd be as ticked off as those who were hired that morning. In fact, it makes total sense to me. They complain. God knows I complain to God. Here we worked all day. We bore the heat of the day. We worked hard for you, and you paid us the same amount as you paid those who've only worked for an hour. That's not fair. And the landowner in the story says, well, didn't we agree to what I would pay you? So why would you be angry about what I pay someone else? And that's the part of the story I really sat with this week, because it's interesting that they would complain, they wouldn't celebrate. One response would be someone worked for an hour and got a denarius, right? They were incapable of celebrating the grace that came to this one person. In other words, they were jealous. I deserve more. How could I celebrate that you got everything for just an hour's work? Think about that. They complained not because they didn't get what they wanted or what they had agreed to. They complained because someone else got something good that they didn't deserve, right? And sad to say, if I look at my own life, I wonder how often I don't really celebrate something good coming to someone even though they didn't deserve it. Because heck knows, I feel like I deserve it, right? I'm a good guy. I do good things. I go to session. And yet, I'm envious. If I freely admit it, I'm envious that someone gets something they don't deserve. There's this thing, I don't know if it's a psychological dynamic here in the 21st century, and if we're honest, we probably could observe it in ourselves. It's when you go on Facebook and you see postings by your family and friends, and they're out having a great time. They're photos of them eating dinner, they're out on an adventure, on a vacation, and that's a fun thing to watch, but they describe this dynamic, this psychological dynamic we have these days, where we actually call it Facebook envy. That we might find ourselves a little jealous and envious that they seem to be having all this fun, and I'm sitting here in front of my computer looking at Facebook, right? The truth is, if we really embrace the generosity of God's grace, we are transformed into generous people. And that's what the world's missing, friends, is a people so generous of spirit and life that it's spread to everyone around them. And how we all, in some ways, probably because we want to make sure we get what's fair, we want to do what we should be paid for, it's hard for us to be that generous to those we don't think who deserve it, whether it be a neighbor we don't like, or whether it be an immigrant who comes to our country, or whether it might be someone of a different political party that we may disagree with. We struggle to live out that grace with the kind of generosity that God gives us. Now, I know one of the things I celebrate in this community is I have experienced you as generous people. Your contributions to our financial campaigns, the generosity of your time and talents, the treasures we share together. I know and have experienced this community as a generous one, willing to embrace, willing to go to El Salvador, willing to do the things in which God's grace can abound and be celebrated. But I hope, and I invite us all to take and have a generosity of spirit so big that we pay attention to the small moments that really is what makes up our lives. Those moments in which we listen to someone even though we may not want to. Those moments when we share a cup of coffee in the community center, caring for each other. It's a small thing, but those are the moments that make life meaningful. We are invited to be changed by God's grace, to become such a generous people, the world is changed. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.